Hi everyone. Today I'm going to be talking about stereotype threat in cross-cultural education. Before I begin, let's look at the topics that I will be discussing today. First, we're going to define stereotype threat. Then we will look at the effects of stereotype threat and anxiety on student performance. And finally, we'll examine a study on immigrant students' educational trajectories and stereotype threat. In the address that he gave during his graduation convocation from Columbia University in 1991, when he received his doctoral degree, Neil deGrasse Tyson said, "In the perception of society, my athletic talents are genetic. I am likely a mug or rapist. My academic failures are expected, and my academic successes are attributed to others. To spend most of my life fighting these attitudes levies an emotional tax that is a form of intellectual emasculation." The emotional tax that Tyson refers to is the undermining role that stereotypes play on academic performance for those who contend with stigmatizing stereotypes that question their abilities. Some examples of this idea include the thought that women are not as good as men at math, or that minorities do not excel at academic tasks. This is the basis for stereotype theory. In the next slide, I will play a short video in which Dr. Claude Steele, the psychologist who originally proposed stereotype theory, describes his thoughts and the process behind stereotype theory.
You know, I often say that people experience stereotype threat several times a day. And the reason is that we have a lot of identities. Our gender, our race, our age. And about each one of those identities that I mentioned, there are negative stereotypes. And when people are in a situation for which a negative stereotype about one of their identities is relevant to the situation, relevant to what they're doing, they know they could be possibly judged or treated in terms of that stereotype. They don't know whether they are or not, but they know they could be. And if the situation is important, that prospect starts to threaten them and upset them and distract them and can affect performance right there in the situation. And so you can find yourself kind of adjusting and deflecting, doing things that would deflect being seen by the stereotype. And it can affect their willingness or their interest in staying in that area of life where that kind of stereotype is relevant.
The year the schools were integrated, I was bused uptown 20 miles. I was in a school with white kids. And on the first day of school, they sectioned us all off and they called out groups 1, 2, 3, and 4, and you went stood in lines. And I'm seeing all the white kids in one line. And I knew that I was, I tested pretty high on test before because I used to study by myself in the school the year before. And so I knew what line I was going in. And I went into that line filled with the white kids. And that year, things changed for me. I lost a lot of confidence. And I was on the stereotype threat. I was scared to raise my hand because I couldn't be wrong, not the black girl who lived downtown.
I'm a social psychologist and experimentalist, and so we've done experiments to test whether or not stereotype threat can have effect on something that we tend to think of as pretty hardwired, like your performance on a cognitive exam or a standardized test. So one simple experiment was to bring women and men into the laboratory, one at a time, and give them a very difficult math test, a math test that we knew would cause frustration. And even though everything was the same for the men and for the woman, the room, the items on the test, the experimenter, for men, as they went along doing the test and experienced frustration, they could worry that they're not as good at math as they maybe thought they were. But they wouldn't be worried that they were confirming some group-based limitation of ability. But for women in the same situation, as they start to experience frustration, some part of their brain might worry, am I confirming the stereotype about women having limited math? Is that what's going on here? And that worry, since these are women women and men who we selected for being very committed to math and very good at it, that worry for that kind of person can be upsetting and distracting and can interfere with their performance right there in the testing situation. And that's exactly what happened. Women did considerably worse than the men. However, and here's the good news, we eventually came up with an idea that would take stereotype threat out of that situation. We simply told them the following: look, you may have heard that women are not as good at difficult standardized tests, but that's not true for this particular standardized test. The test that you're taking today is a test on which women always do as well as men. So the subtext of that little statement is, look, the frustration you're having on this test has nothing to do with your being a woman. Now we've taken this extra pressure that women might have in this situation out of the situation. They're no longer under the pressure of confirming or being seen to confirm something, some limitation that's out there in the stereotypes of our society about women lacking math. And if that's what's been depressing their performance earlier, now their performance should go up to match that of equally skilled men. And that is exactly what happened. With that little sentence, women's performance matched that of men. So some forms of this threat are pretty minor and almost humorful, and other forms of this threat are really poignant. One thing to say in a facing history context is that stereotypes is one way by which history affects present life. The stereotypes are built up over the history of a society, and they can have an impact on people's functioning in the immediate present situations, and are big factors in the way our society functions. Who goes into what kinds of fields? Who enjoys what kinds of work? These things are driven in big part by these kinds of threats.
As Dr. Steele described, stereotype theory is really just when there are negative stereotypes about the intellectual capacity or other ability of a certain stigmatized group. The people within that group have increased anxiety because of the perceived stereotype, which inhibits their performance on whatever task they're attempting. The more unfamiliar or complicated the task is, the more pronounced stereotype theory or stereotype threat will become. Evaluative scrutiny and group composition also contribute to stereotype threat. That's just whether or not you think you're really being evaluated based on a task or your performance in a certain situation. And then group composition obviously is just who makes up the group of people that you're in when you're taking on this task. Anyone can be influenced by perceived negative stereotypes about a group in which they include themselves. People develop these, what we call pejorative interpretations of failure. And basically that's a negative stereotype about their own ability. And these pejorative interpretations, when experienced by minority groups, perpetuate the belief that failure is a lack of ability rather than a challenge to be overcome. So in other words, they just create this never-ending cycle of doubt and anxiety and underperformance based on what they think another person believes about them. Domain identification which is just the extent to which an individual defines themselves through a role or a performance in an area such as academics, has a positive correlation with academic performance from minority students. In other words, the stronger a student identifies themselves on their academic performance, the more likely they are to succeed in that academic performance. But if they are impacted by stereotype threat, then the stereotype threat is actually going to undermine their academic performance. And in that case, the stronger their domain identification, the worse their academic performance is going to be when they are under the influence of stereotype threat, because they develop more anxiety about whether or not they're really able to manage the academic tasks that they are given. So anxiety caused by the stereotype threat really creates this aversive situation, which causes people to want to escape or withdraw from the situation, which also can lead to lower academic performance because of this stereotype threat and anxiety cycle. Stereotype threat is made worse by any kind of a fixed ability mindset. Growth mindset interventions could possibly be most effective at middle school level if we were going to introduce something like that, because it's at that point in your education at the secondary level where we see more of a shift in the mindset of teachers from a growth mindset or growth ability to a more fixed ability mindset. Up until 6th grade, there's very little evidence that stereotype threat affects performance of minority groups or stigmatized groups. There's not really an achievement gap. By the 6th grade, though, the achievement gap between stigmatized minority groups and those not affected by that stigma can widen as much as 2 grade levels. That's when there's the earliest difference in their confidence, in the confidence between groups of children and their academic ability. And that's when it really begins to manifest itself as stereotype threat, which causes anxiety, which causes underperformance on academic tasks. Teachers actually can make this situation worse because some teachers at the middle school level, that secondary level, start to adopt a more fixed ability view of academic ability, and they adopt that thought that, well, what I see the student do today is as good as they're ever going to be able to do. If they're bad at math now, they're always going to be mad at math. Or if they're bad at reading, or they struggle with reading, they're always going to struggle with that from here on out. And that's really when we start to see the shift to that fixed mindset that starts to cause stereotype threat to have more of an effect on students, which widens an achievement gap between, for example, in our area, white students and minority students. Individuals actually don't have to believe a stereotype about the group with which they identify in order for them to experience the effects of stereotype threat. They only have to be aware that stereotype exists for it to affect their academic performance. Another interesting thing about stereotype threat is that when it's removed, when we can remove stereotype threat, which really just takes minor tweaking in an activity, achievement gaps disappear. An example of a tweak that you can make in a assessment situation that causes an achievement gap to disappear because it undermines stereotype threat is to tell students in the testing population that everyone always performs really well on this test, or to tell them that we're not diagnosing your ability by this test. This is just to see what you can do, or if you can remove that that thought that whatever assessment or task that the student is taking on is diagnostic of their ability, a stereotype threat disappears and they're able to perform at their maximum academic achievement level. Another thing that can possibly help remove stereotype threat for students is creating a sense of belonging at school. There are some mixed results with this particular type of intervention, which we'll see in the study that I had you guys read for tonight, or for Wednesday night rather. But there have been instances where fostering a more accepting culture within the school has reduced stereotype threat. So one of the main problematic effects of stereotype threat is that it causes anxiety in stigmatized groups of people. And as we know, anxiety increases physiological arousal. It can increase your heart rate, your blood pressure, increase your skin temperature. It can, because of all of these things, it can cause you to have difficulty regulating your attention. And anxiety can also reduce your short-term memory capacity. And all of these feelings cause so much discomfort with whatever academic task or assessment that a student's being required to perform on, that it creates an aversive situation. So that student or that individual would rather escape the situation and just be done with it as fast as they can, rather than persevere through the challenge and meet their maximum academic potential. All of this is kind of explained by the Eisnick and Calvo's processing efficiency theory, which just says that as stress increases and anxiety increase, cognitive efficiency suffers, and as cognitive efficiency decreases, performance on an academic task is going to decrease, or good performance is going to take longer to achieve. And that's just going to create a cyclical situation where you're perpetually moving from anxiety to underperformance to more anxiety to more underperformance because you have self-doubt because of a perceived stereotype threat. So here's a visual of that cycle that I was just talking about, where it starts with self-blame, for example. I think I was even probably a little bit guilty of this in junior high of, I'm terrible at math. I can't do it. It's hard for me. Math is a boys' subject. Guys are going to do better at it than me. So I can't do it, which leads to increased anxiety, especially whenever you're taking an assessment or performing on some sort of task where your math ability is being diagnosed, which is going to lead to poor performance because you don't have the focus and the short-term memory that you need to be successful on the task. And so you don't work through the challenge of the task. Instead, you give up on it, which leads to more self-blame, more anxiety, and then you just get into this vicious cycle. Well, if a student identifies themselves strongly with school, they feel like academics really defines who they are, and then they get into a situation where stereotype threat decreases their academic performance because they start doubting their ability based on what other people think. Eventually they're going to disidentify with it, academics, and they'll just quit caring about how they do, and then their performance really will decrease severely, which could even lead to something as serious as a student withdrawing from school. So next I'd like to move into looking at a little bit of the research that has been done on stereotype threat. Specifically, I've asked you guys to read a study about the immigrant immigrant students' educational trajectories, which look at the influence of cultural identity and stereotype threat on academic performance of immigrant students in Austria. So we're going to begin by looking at the goals, then talking of the study, then talking about the methods that were used, and finally we'll summarize those results. So the goal of the study was to investigate the effect of a social belonging intervention on immigrant students at educational achievement in high schools in Austria. Part of the interest of the researchers that conducted the study was to see if they could combine the ideas of the acculturation framework by Berry with stereotype threat theory. They hypothesized that by normalizing immigrant students' doubts about belonging and increasing a feeling of belonging to residence culture, that they would see a positive impact on educational success of immigrant students that would counteract stereotype threat. So before we get into that too far, let's just look at the acculturation framework really quickly. The acculturation framework presented by Berry states that there are 4 different levels of acculturation or identification that people can have. Integration, separation, assimilation, and marginalization. And both of those are based on how much a person identifies with the resident culture in which they are living, and also how much they identify with their own ethnic background. And the ultimate goal is that you achieve integration where a person is accepting of both their ethnic background and comfortable with the culture in which they reside, to a point that those mesh and they are able to live, as the researchers hypothesized, with less stereotype. So this study was carried out in a 2x2 design, comparing immigration background to the results of the experimental intervention that was used. Participants were first-year high school students in Austria who were randomly assigned either to a control group or to the treatment group. The study measured several different variables. Academic achievement was measured using GPA and dropout rates. Academic belonging, domain identification, and stereotype vulnerability were assessed using self-reported scales. And cultural identity strength was assessed using the multi-group ethnic identity measure and the resident culture identity measure. And then some additional measures that were assessed, again, using self-reported scales, were learning and achievement motivation, motivation at school, well-being, self-esteem, self-concept clarity, and classroom climate. The research was carried out over 3 different testing periods, labeled time 1, time 2, and time 3. At time 1, students were assigned either to the control group or the intervention group, and they were assigned a fictitious article and writing assignment. The control group was given a writing assignment over a fictitious article about bicycling and the environment, and they were expected to write about the impact of bicycling and the environment and how it personally pertains to them. And then the intervention group was given a fictitious scientific study of problems that students face when entering high school. And then they were asked to write about their personal experiences, thoughts, and feelings on how it felt to enter a new high school to enter high school. And before the intervention was carried out, they did the self-assessment on all of the different measures that they were collecting data on for the study. At time 2, again, they began by the self-assessment and collecting all the data for the study. And then they had students fill in a sentence completion task related to whichever topic they were assigned from time 1. So the intervention groups still answered questions based on problems that students face when they come to high school, and the control group was given fill-in-the-blank questions about bicycling and the environment. And then at time 3, they collected the final data on belonging, social identity, academic achievement, and all of those measures that they had identified as variables for the study. So the results of the study, just based on the way the researchers addressed their discussion or began their discussion at the end of the article, really seemed to surprise the researchers. The belonging treatment did not affect educational outcomes for immigrant students at all. Across the board, immigrant students saw drops in GPA, academic belonging, stereotype vulnerability, and domain identification. What these results seem to indicate is that stereotype threat is always present, and these results support previous findings that higher stereotype threat vulnerability will decrease educational outcomes for students. Now, the article did point out that there have been mixed results in using belonging intervention to counteract stereotype threat. They cited a US study in which African American students were provided with belonging intervention. And in that study, they actually saw positive academic results rather than a continued decline in educational outcomes as a result of stereotype threat. Further research is definitely needed regarding what interventions could improve acculturation and reduce stereotype threat for all students, not even just immigrants. I feel like stereotype threat affects everyone. There's not a student that doesn't belong to some group that has some sort of stereotype attached with that group. So it's important, especially for those of us going into school psychology, that we're aware of that stereotype threat and we are looking for ways to help counteract the effects of stereotype threat for the students with whom we interact once we are in schools. And the same could be said for any clinical psychologist who is going to provide treatment for adolescents or really adults too. Stereotype threat is going to be there, and it's going to impact our performance in academic and work-based tasks because it will increase anxiety. So it's something that we as a psychology community need to further research and find interventions that might help counteract that stereotype threat. Because as Dr. Steele pointed out, it doesn't take much to counteract that threat. We just need to find an effective way to do it that works across the board. So I hope you found my presentation on stereotype threat beneficial and educational. And I hope it really makes you think about what we can do to decrease the effects of stereotype threat on students and adults in our society.